So I will also say that this presentation, one more time, has received support from a grant from the Waltham Cultural Council, which is a local agency, and receives funding from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, Mass Cultural Council, which is a state agency. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to Donnie Weisse. Donnie Weisse is our, as he said earlier, this is your first full year, I guess, as our farm historian here at Gore Place. And he has been delving into farming in the time period and at Gore Place in particular. And so Donnie, why don't you go ahead and give us your presentation about gentleman farming at Gore Estate.
All right. Welcome everybody, I'm Donnie. So tonight's presentation, gentleman farming at the Gore Estate. So I'm gonna talk a bit about gentleman farming in Great Britain as well, and in New England. And then we'll get into farming at the Gore Estate. So like Tom said, Waltham Cultural Council. And here's a little, you can find this on our website. All right, so we will start with this question. What is a gentleman farmer? So a good place to start is to explain what they weren't, and they were not yeomen. So they were not small landholders. They were not subsistence farmers, which was the vast majority of not just the New England population, but the American population in the early 19th century. So gentleman farmers instead were typically wealthy landowners, often very wealthy, who didn't farm for a subsistence or a profit, but or at least not primarily. Instead, they farmed for pleasure, as a hobby, and as a passion project. So these were usually on estates that were larger than the average farm, and they were usually more carefully designed. They tended to use their land for agricultural improvement and experimentation. And what sort of sets them apart from the average farmer is not just the size and the beauty of the estate, but sort of what they're able to do there. So they can import new breeds, they can import different farming tools, they can afford to have greenhouses, which are great for experimenting. So I think that's really what sets them apart, is just this isn't a livelihood for them. This is sort of, they've made their money doing something else, and they get to have a little bit of fun on their farm. So to understand how gentleman farming caught on around Boston and why a number of the city's wealthiest men decided to become gentleman farmer, we have to travel back across the pond to Great Britain. Gentleman farming was a very British pastime with a long history, but the golden age of gentleman farming in Great Britain begins around the late 18th century. And so let's talk a bit about the history of farming in Great Britain. So until relatively recently, when industrial farming became the main way of growing food, the predominant form of agriculture in Great Britain was mixed husbandry. So this is an integrated style of animal and crop raising. Farmers would raise animals on pastures for their meat, their hides, and they would use the manure, which was mostly animal dung, but could also be mixed with different yard waste, any organic matter. And they would use that to fertilize their growing fields where they grew grains and vegetables. Farmers also grew hay, which kept animals fed throughout the winter when pasture wasn't available. Although back in England, the climate's a little easier to farm than here in New England. So they had shorter winters, which meant they could keep their animals out on pasture a bit longer. And an important part of the system of mixed husbandry was crop rotation, or field rotation and fallow. So to avoid soil exhaustion, farmers would rotate their field each year and change what each field was used for. So usually every fourth year, they would allow one field to fallow, which meant topping it with manure and letting it be and not growing anything on it. And this was thought to allow the soil to rebuild and recover nutrients after years of extraction from crop raising or from serving as pasture, which can be very taxing on the land, because the animals, especially sheep, will chew right down to the root, and it's tough for grass to recover. So around the 16th century begins the so-called British Agricultural Revolution. And an important improvement was made to this farming system during the revolution. And this was removing fallow from the rotation and replacing it with more growing. But farmers, they weren't just growing any crops, they grew crops that improved the soil, mainly clover and turnips. So turnips were capable of thriving during the winter, and they have deep roots that let them absorb minerals that are mostly inaccessible because they dig much deeper down into the soil than your average shallow rooted vegetable. So they were more than just a cover crop, though. You could also use them as fodder. So you could feed animals your turnips. So you'd plant them in the fields. It would reach down, pull nutrients that were deep under the soil, help fertilize your fields, and then you could harvest them and feed them to your animals. And then clover, on the other hand, played an important role by converting nitrogen from the atmosphere into more useful nitrogen in the soil. So clover pulls it out of the atmosphere and then through its roots adds it back to the soil. So they call that a nitrogen fixer, and that also fertilizes. So this shift, it allowed for much more intensive cultivation, and it also allowed for more fodder to feed animals. And this all led to just more or better soil fertility. All right, so this is a modern picture. You can tell by the color, but you can sort of imagine what a British farm looks like here. So it's, you got a lot of sheep here, and the fields sort of divided. The British Agricultural Revolution. So the British Agricultural Revolution, it wasn't so much a single revolution as a series of periods over a few centuries when great strides were made in productivity. So while new farming methods like the one I just mentioned was really important, another important part of the British Agricultural Revolution was the enclosure movement and its social effects. So the British Agricultural Revolution kicks off a period of great upheaval in the British countryside. So while farmers had their homes, the fields they used to grow their food were not part of enclosed properties owned and operated only by themselves, as farms typically are today. Instead, a lot of their farmland was actually common space, and it was shared by a lot of small farmers for common usage. So small towns, all the farmers would coordinate and share their land, and they would it was called an infield outfield rotation. So you'd have your infield where you grew your crops, and you had your outfield where you had your animals. And it was sort of a very communal approach to farming. And it was not like the big fenced in farms that you'd see today where it's a single proprietor. These were shared fields. But in Great Britain, unlike here in New England, rural land was mostly owned or entirely owned by landlords. So even though the farmers lived there and farmed there, the land was actually owned by someone else. So as population grew and became more valuable, these landlords needed to increase production on their land. And why? Well, a lot of them just wanted to make more money. A lot of them were also in debt, and Britain was pretty much always engaged in war, as I'm sure many of you know. And whether it's colonizing, or if it's the conflict with France, which happens a lot, raising and arming troops was really expensive, and the landlords who held all the country's wealth had to cover the costs. And landlords, who were often or always members of the nobility or the gentry, they had large estates with expensive upkeep. So over the years, debt builds up, and they had to make money. By the late 17th, early 18th century, they start building up debt, and they have to pay off this money. So to do so, they start enclosing the commons. So the small scale self-provisioning farming practiced by peasants wasn't making much money. They were paying rent with it. They were giving food to the landlords or paying what little money they had. But that wasn't enough to pay off the debts. So landlords decided to consolidate their holdings, and they would kick off the peasants and they enclose the commons. So this is the enclosure movement, and it intensified in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially as wool prices increased. So more and more landlords turned to sheep farming as a way to make a quick buck. So with help from Parliament, they, most landlords were in Parliament, or Parliament was mostly composed of landlords. So they passed legislation and helped push peasants off the farms, and they were able to convert their farms into more profitable sheep farms. So this leads to industrialization and urbanization. So the enclosure movement and the subsequent clearances, as they're called, it really contributed to the rise of industrial cities. So rising agricultural productivity due to improved methods. It also lessened the amount of labor necessary on farms. So the British Agricultural Revolution, it really increased productivity, not as much labor was required. So there were already less farmers needed. And then with the enclosure movement, sort of the rest of them are pushed out, and they end up flocking to cities. And this is towards the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So many of these former farm laborers went to work in cities and factories, and cities grew very quickly. And the extreme inequality that resulted from this is really unfortunate. A lot of people had to flee. A lot of people moved to North America, and a lot of people also just moved into cities and ended up living sort of in squalor. I mean, you can look up old pictures of you can see here. But living in these cities was really hard. Working in these factories is really hard. But it's because of this industrialization and urbanization that a lot of landlords, especially those growing sheep and selling the wool, are making a whole lot of money. So a new wealthy class emerges. Here is an English country estate, some sheep out front. So now this brings us back to gentleman farmers. So it's around this time in the 18th and 19th centuries when many affluent individuals, often from this aristocracy, they decided to engage in agriculture as a form of leisure, but also as a way of displaying their status and their prestige. But also more benevolently, I call it a benevolent hobby. They also would conduct experiments and try to contribute to scientific agriculture. So they were really passionate about agricultural improvement. Improvement was the big word of the day. So none pushed their own plow. So gentlemen farmers, they would usually employ, or always employed, a farm manager, and they would also hire laborers to oversee day-to-day operations, while they would enjoy the lifestyle pretty much. So they weren't out in the fields working, but they were overseeing their farm and making sure it looked nice, and they were conducting experiments, but they were not doing the work. But the this benevolent hobby, as I call it, was experimenting with new farming techniques, with growing new crops and breeding livestock. So while they definitely benefited a lot from industrialization, and there was a lot of wealth built up in their class during that time, they were trying to give back a little bit. So in New England, gentleman farming emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, similarly to England during the industrial expansion in the region. So it starts in Great Britain, but gentleman farming doesn't take long to come over and reach New England. But there are some differences between the two. So land ownership, so the property size. Farms in Great Britain, gentleman farms in Great Britain, were a lot bigger. In New England, the average size of farms tended to be a lot smaller. And this resulted, they tended to have smaller, not just farms, but also their properties, their houses. They generally had less wealth than their British counterparts. And then it was more specialized in Britain. So British farmers, like I said, tended to specialize in sheep. So they were trying to make a lot of money with wool, whereas gentlemen farmers in New England were more concerned with having the lifestyle, with having the country house where they had different crops and different animals. It wasn't so much a business to them as it was to some of the British gentleman farmers. And then class consciousness. So the social context of gentleman farming is very different in these two countries. So in Britain, it's deeply rooted in the class system. So gentleman farming was an aristocratic endeavor. The land was passed through generation after generation. But in New England, social hierarchies definitely existed, but they were generally less rigid and not as pronounced. And the common farmer, the average New Englander, was a lot more skeptical and critical of their wealthy neighbors than the British peasants were of their aristocracy. So wealthy people living in New England around Boston were the subject of a lot of skepticism and criticism. So around Boston and right here in Waltham, gentlemen farmers had to be a little less ostentatious, a little more practical, a little more utilitarian than their British counterparts. So a really great book that I used to help write this webinar is Tamara Plakins Thornton's book called, where is it? Cultivated Gentlemen. Sorry, I lost the name of the book. Cultivating Gentlemen, sorry. So, and she has a great quote. So between the Revolution and the Civil War, many of Boston's elites settled on country estates, took up gentleman farming, and made a stab at horticultural experimentation. Even more, identified themselves with what contemporaries termed rural pursuits through active membership in agricultural and horticultural societies. So common New Englanders are overwhelmingly farmers, and they're skeptical of wealth, especially when it's made through finance or through speculation. And unlike in Great Britain, for the Bostonian, land was a trading of power, prestige, and wealth acquired elsewhere, most likely, like I said, through finance or through maritime. Whereas in Britain, land was inherited and it was passed down through generations. So financial speculation, it was generally associated with avarice and greed. And while farming was widely respected as a more humble and noble occupation, that was more consistent with Protestant values. So you remember, New England is very religious. It's still, the Boston area was very Puritan. And this had a pretty substantial influence on the way they viewed wealth. And so since many of Boston's wealthiest men had obtained their wealth through financial dealings, they had a bit of a PR problem when they ran, as they often did, for public office. So for them, gentleman farming, it had an ulterior motive that British landlords who were part of this age-old aristocracy did not really have to consider, and that was relating to the common man. And to quote Thornton again, what we may define merely as different kinds of economic enterprise were, for Americans of the early Republic and antebellum decades, morally charged categories freighted with symbolic significance. None of this added up to anything favorable to elite Bostonians, because the connotations of urban commerce and manufacturing were in the main negative, whereas those of rural life and agriculture were largely positive. So you can see how there's sort of this skepticism, not just of wealth, but of a specific kind of wealth. And people like Christopher Gore, they had to become gentleman farmers, not just to flaunt their wealth, but to improve their image and gain the trust and respect of their fellow citizens. So while it's easy to look at a big estate and say, oh, they wanted to have a nice, big, beautiful mansion, at the same time, they sort of had this obligation, especially as public figures, to give back a little, to experiment, improve agriculture, to sort of not just sit on your pile of money, but to try and be a good citizen. But at the same time, they weren't always successful. So Christopher Gore, for example, his lifestyle was distinctly British and aristocratic in tone, some historians say. And his political opponents, when he was running for governor, actually were quick to compare him to English nobility. And there's a quote, "Whose carriage is that rolls so majestically through the street? One might as well elect the Duke of York." So that's a quote from a newspaper. So people were still, even though Christopher and other gentleman farmers were trying to give back, people were still skeptical and thought that they appeared to be too British. So having this country estate is a double-edged sword. It's aristocratic and British, but it also gave wealthy urban men like Gore the opportunity to do something more widely trusted and respected, which was owning a farm. And so this is a good quote here from Thornton. "It is a curious fact of history that the same men directly responsible for changing the Massachusetts economy from a farming to a commercial and industrial one, merchants, financiers, manufacturers, and their legal and political advocates, should have endeavored so assiduously to identify themselves with things rural and agrarian." So this painting is from our collection. It hangs in Christopher Gore's office, and this is of the Boston Manufacturing Company. And Christopher Gore was an early investor of this company, and like many of his wealthy contemporaries, he was a gentleman farmer as well. And so you can see industrialization is beginning here. It's still predominantly a rural landscape. It's still an agrarian economy. Most Massachusetts residents are farmers, and they still hold those values. They're still skeptical of industrialization and the men funding these. So they, sorry, I think I turned it green. They're generally skeptical of them. So the farmers have to give back a bit. And how do they do this? So agricultural organizations. So by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as gentleman farming is becoming more popular among Boston's elite, societies and organizations centered around agricultural improvements start popping up. So these organizations were founded by wealthy men like Gore, and these organizations would publish periodical journals, and these would have information meant to improve productivity and really meant to help their neighbors' farms, and not to mention to prove that their rural pursuits, as Thornton calls them, was more than just self-gratification and a way to flaunt wealth. Thornton says, what changed with the revolution, that's the American Revolution, were the criteria that determined a legitimate ruling class. So now public virtue, the ability to place the public good before private gain, was the operative criterion. Nothing was said about social or economic standing. So what that means is, to be a leader, which these wealthy men wanted to be, like Gore, you had to give back. It was not enough just to have a lot of money and to be a big name and a wealthy guy. You had to prove that you were able to put others' needs before yourselves. You had to be a virtuous leader with a genuine regard for your fellow farmers and fellow citizens. And so these publications, so the Massachusetts Society for Promoting Agriculture had one, Massachusetts Horticultural Society. These organizations, they were founded to help give back, and they would have, in addition to prizes and awards for categories like, for example, best tasting fruit or largest vegetable, the journals would also pass along knowledge and relayed results of different experiments that gentleman farmers were doing. And Christopher Gore was really involved with these, and he helped found the MSPA in 1792. And then even his wife, Rebecca Gore, was involved. So the Massachusetts Horticultural Society is founded a bit later in 1829. And Rebecca Gore provided some financial support to the organization when it was still pretty young, and she ended up being posthumously honored by Mass Hort. So now that we have, now that we have some background on the British beginnings and how it caught on around Boston, let's talk about our favorite gentleman farmer, Christopher Gore. So this is a great quote that I think really captures the essence of his farm, and I'll let you read it. So the big thing here, not improved merely to gratify personal feelings. So like I said, it's more than just flaunting your wealth and self-gratification. It's about actually farming. It's about improving agriculture. It's about having, you had to have a real passion for this, and Christopher Gore did. So as is true for all his contemporaries, the British influence is really strong, even still. Gore served as a diplomat in Great Britain from 1796 to 1804. And while he was there, he met some really famous British improvers, and he attended 2 sheep shearings, which were world renowned. These are really big deal for farmers, especially in the English speaking world. And one of them was Thomas Coke. Thomas Coke here on the right. He had a big sheep shearing festival, and this was a much different one than the ones we have here at Gore Place. So back then, they weren't community events that were open to all. These were for gentlemen farmers. This was a boys' club. This was not the great event that we have. This was a pretty elite circle, and while Gore was over there, he was exposed to these events. He really got a taste of the lifestyle, and he decides to hire a gardener. So there's actually the first, we have the letter written. It's at Massachusetts Historical Society. Gore hired a gardener named William Hay, and Hay he sent back to work on his estate while Gore was staying in England as a diplomat. So we have the note, basically their contract that they both signed. And Hay came over here and began gardening, working on the estate while Gore was still a diplomat in Europe. What else? So agricultural journals. Yeah. So Gore, he was really influenced by the British improvers. He was always read up on them. Even in our collection still, we have a lot of books on agriculture and scientific farming. So while he wasn't pushing his own plow, he still kept informed. So he was definitely involved with the day-to-day operations. He was, overseeing things and often talking with his farm manager. And he also imported tools. So we have a quote here from Thornton. She says, he did his best to obtain a new farming implement that Coke used at Holcomb. So he must have really admired Coke here at the sheep shearing festival or event because he was trying to track down something he saw there. There was some tools, and that was pretty common for gentleman farmers. You wanted to get the nice, expensive equipment that you see over in Europe. So as I mentioned earlier, they didn't push their own plow. So Gore was no exception to that. And he hired a large team of workers. And this included a farm manager, a garden manager, and seasonal laborers. And one of these farm managers was Jacob Farwell. So Farwell kept a day book from 1820 to 1826, and we actually still have it in our collection. And some of you might remember we had a webinar on Farwell that Tom did on the farm workers of Gore Place. And so from this daybook, we know a whole lot about the farm, which was, unlike many other gentleman farms, intended to turn a profit. So it's run like a business. And Christopher is more than just a gentleman farmer. He's a businessman. Sort of his personality, we know he speculated, he was involved with investing in industrial pursuits. So it would have been uncharacteristic of him to just have this big farm and not do anything with it. So he ran it like a business, and being in Waltham, which was very rural, he had a lot of space to work with. So the farm was about 400 acres. It stretched all the way down to the Charles River, and most of the land was either pasture or cultivated to grow crops. So very little wasted land. This is a very productive landscape, and they're growing a whole bunch of crops and a whole bunch of animals. And so the farm, they grew food to feed the family, obviously, but also they would sell it. So they sold it in Boston Market, and this was usually, so here's Quincy Market. This is in the 19th century, probably a little later after Gore, but they had a stall in Boston, and Isaac, who is the farm manager, Jacob's brother, was usually in charge of manning this stall where they would sell their produce. And here is a map of the estate. So 1822, this is all from Farwell's daybook. So a quick thank you to Electa Trish. She's not here tonight, but she actually just finished transcribing the entire journal, which is awesome. And it's been super helpful for me and for really for anybody interested in Gore Place and its history. This we just so much information, and you can see here how the whole thing was set up. So we have an orchard. So they're growing a whole bunch of different things. Most of these you'll recognize, but then there's some weird ones like Mangelwurzel, which is related, sort of a cousin of the beet. It looks like a yellow beet, sort of. And then there's a large cattle herd. So the cattle barn here is right where if you're from Waltham, you'll know the Sunoco gas station, or the Shell gas station across the street from Gore Place. That is where the cattle barn used to be. So experiments and improvements. So while the farm was run like a business, perhaps more in line with the gentleman farming tradition is the fact that Gore's farm was used for experimentation, and improvement was a big word at the time, agricultural improvement. And to improve agriculture, you have to do a lot of experimenting. So as I mentioned, Gore kept himself updated on the latest methods with agricultural journals, and we sort of see how that bleeds into Farwell's daybook. So we see a lot of experimentation with soil. So we'll see 2 teams after lime and manure, seaweed, carting mud, lime with the pond mud, mixing manure. So there's a whole lot of references, and this is just a fraction of them, a whole lot of references to manure and soil and different types of manure. So not all animal dung is equal, which farmers know. They knew that some were better than others, some worked for some crops better than others. So there's a whole lot of experimentation, and Gore was sure to be involved with that. And we see, we see that in his letters to Rufus King, who is a good friend of his, and I'll talk about him in a couple slides. So a lot of experimentation, while there was definitely a lot of experimentation outside on the farm, a lot of experimentation was also in the greenhouse. And this is the greenhouse at the Vale, the Lyman estate. And the Lymans built the greenhouse in 1804, and then the Gores were likely inspired by it because they built a very similar one 2 years later in 1806. So we have a team of archaeologists from UMass Boston who come and do excavations at Gore Place every so often, and they believe that the greenhouse was really similar to the one at the Lyman Estate. So the greenhouse, it no longer exists today at Gore, but it stood between the house and the coach house. And there's a big, if you're ever on the property where the big beech tree is, that is where the greenhouse was. And greenhouses were a really important part of early 19th century landscape gardening and scientific agriculture. And as characteristic of the entire estate, the greenhouse was visually pleasing, but also utilitarian. It had marble floors, just like the house. It had piped-in heating, and this allowed year-round growing, which was really important. It allowed Gore's garden manager to raise exotic fruits that otherwise wouldn't be grown in New England, like citruses. But then in addition to exotic fruits, the gardener was also experimenting with different growing methods. And he was grafting and propagating plants. And so only one pot of all those recovered at the site of the greenhouse was unlikely to be used for planting. Because of its design and dimensions, archaeologists figured this pot was probably used in the kitchen, but the fact that it was found in the greenhouse suggests it might have been used to carry food scraps. So, maybe bone or other organic scraps from the kitchen were carried out to the greenhouse to be used as fertilizer. And so another piece recovered from the greenhouse is a mended clay pot, and it was inscribed with markings, scratches, some X's, a series of numbers, and a lowercase g. And there was also a numerical equation. So definitely seems like there's some experimentation going on. And that's just from one recovered pot. There's probably a whole lot more that's lost to history, but we do know that the greenhouse was a really important part of the whole operation, and there was definitely a lot of experimentation going on there. So the gardener was working in the greenhouse, but they were also working outside in the orchard. So the gardener was in charge of fruit. The Gores had an orchard with apple and pear trees. And a lot of apples were pressed into cider, which was the most popular beverage at the time. But then a lot of them were eaten by laborers. But they were not just for the laborers and for cider, they were also bred to be eaten fresh and for even to enter competition. So Roderick Toohey, who is the gardener employed by Rebecca Gore after Christopher died, won an award for Best Native Pear in 1830. He was honored by the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, and he named it the Heathcote pear after an old gardener that had worked for Gore named Heathcote. And and this is a picture of it right here. So this is also in our collection. So correspondence with Rufus King. So Rufus King was good friends with Christopher at Harvard. They went to school together, and then they both went on to have great political careers. So Rufus moved to New York, and he had a farm in Queens, and it's still there today. Not as big as a property as Gore Place, but the two of them were both gentlemen farmers, and they frequently wrote about agricultural matters. So I have a few quotes here that I'll let you read, and it just shows how much these two really care about their farms. And this is just a handful out of a whole bunch of letters. The two of them wrote about their farms constantly. They were, you can tell that they were closely observing it. And while, gentlemen farmers are not out in the fields doing the work, they are really involved with the day-to-day operation. There's clearly a passion there, and I'll let you read these. And so this quote down here, I can send you as many oxbows as you want. I think that this one's really indicative of sort of a bigger trend among gentleman farmers, and that was passing not just information but farming tools. So because they have the money, they can afford to send extras to their friends, and they sort of traded back and forth. And you see at the top the ornamental trees that he would spare. So there's a whole lot of trading going on. It's sort of this little economy among them, and they all share this hobby, and they would always gloat about their farms or their estates, but they would also get into sort of the nitty gritty of it, and about the day-to-day stuff on the farm. And so the legacy. So what is the legacy of gentleman farmers? So like I said earlier, these farmers, it was a way to display wealth, but it was also a way to give back, especially in New England, because you had to win over your yeoman neighbors. You had to, especially if you were going to run for governor like Christopher Gore did, you had to be a little more relatable, a little more down to earth, literally and figuratively. And so how successful were they? So like I said, they had publications. They would write their agricultural journals, and these didn't seem to have a big impact at first. A lot of common farmers were generally skeptical of gentleman farmers, and sort of like anything else, they're like, oh, we don't need that. This is I know what I'm doing. But today, it's generally accepted that gentleman farmers did have a positive impact on agriculture through their experiments and through their attempts to disseminate knowledge. But it was mostly through introducing new tools and breeds. So because they were able to transport or import different farming implements and breeds, they had access to better tools and more productive or more powerful animals than most yeomen. So because of that, they were able to introduce these new animals and new tools, and in a matter of years, it was only a matter of time before these were more accessible to the public. But I think the greater and more the better part of this legacy is the respect for the land, and this passion about agriculture and using land wisely. So yes, it's nice to make your land look nice, but you should also make good use of it. And it's about more than having a nice lawn. It's about having a beautiful but also productive estate, and that's what Gore Place still does today. So we have this beautiful mansion, but we also have a working farm, and it's a very beautiful property. People love to walk around, but it's also productive. And I think that is, there's one thing we take away from gentleman farmers, it's caring for the land and making it look nice, but also making good and wise use of it with sustainable agriculture.